So to finish round 2, you need to do what we just did, an increase stitch 5 more times. So 1 increase stitch in each remaining stitch of round 1. And that's because for round 2, we're ultimately going for 6 increase stitches, which is actually considered a total of 12 stitches. And that is again because an increase stitch counts as 2 single crochet stitches in the same stitch. And if that was confusing, don't worry about it for now. The next video explains why 6 increase stitches actually equals 12 stitches. For now, just trust me that we're going to make a total of 12 stitches, but they're being called 6 increase stitches. So first, before we do that, we need to move this stitch marker, the differently colored stitch marker, because the proper way to use stitch markers when crocheting in continuous rounds is by using it to mark the very first stitch of the round that you're currently on. And that's because if you ever make a mistake, which you inevitably will, especially because this is your first time crocheting, you can use this stitch marker to help you count how many stitches you've done, and also use it so that that's the stopping point, so you don't have to undo everything you did to fix a mistake. So first, we're going to pull on the hook until this loop gets really big, and then we're going to put our hook aside. And we do this because in case you accidentally pull on the yarn connected to the ball, you've got some leeway before you lose the stitches that you just did. Now we are going to rotate our piece so that we're looking at the rim, and what we're ultimately looking for are those horizontal V's. Each V represents a stitch. And because we just did an increase stitch, where we can see the 2 V's that make up that increase stitch over here. So just to be clear, this loop that your hook came from does not count as a stitch. The first stitch to count is the first V that this loop comes from. So because we made an increase stitch that was made up of 2 stitches, it means that the very first stitch of round 2 is actually this stitch. So we're going to take the stitch marker, and you can keep a hold on this stitch so you don't accidentally lose track of it, and then put it under the V that represents that stitch. And now you know, if you ever mess up, you can always just only come back to this point, and you know that this is for sure the first stitch of round 2. All right, so now we're going to put our hook back in the loop. And the way you know which way to put it back in the loop is that if you pull on the yarn connected to the ball, the yarn that should move is the yarn that's closer to you. That way your loop is straight. You don't want to put your hook in this way where the yarn that moves is behind and further away from you because your loop is twisted. All right, so pull on that loop so that the diameter of the loop on your hook is about the same size as the diameter of the tip of your hook. Don't want it too tight and you don't want it too loose. Now get back into crocheting position, so put the yarn around your hand and hold on to your piece. So to make the next increase stitch of round 2, you need to put your hook in the same spot as the very first of the 2 same colored stitch markers. And while we still have stitch markers here helping you how to see what a stitch looks like, now is also a great time to start getting used to looking for those horizontal V's by yourself. So you're going to put your hook under that horizontal V marked by the stitch marker. Now yarn over and pull that yarn through that V so you have 2 loops on the hook. Now yarn over again and pull it through both loops on the hook. Next, since we just made a single crochet stitch, but an increase stitch is 2 single crochet stitches put in the same spot, it means that we need to put our hook in exactly the same spot that we just put it in, and then do a single crochet stitch again. And since we have this handy dandy stitch marker here, we know that we need to put our hook over here, but as you can see in the rest of your circle, you're going to run out of these stitch markers soon. So let's take the time while we have the stitch marker to train our eyes and learn some ways that we can figure this out without the help of a stitch marker. So the easiest way to tell where you just made a stitch is by doing what I call the good old tugging method, hold onto your piece with one hand and then hold onto the stitch you just made with the other. And then you literally just pull on it to see which hole moves. The hole that moves is the spot that you just put your hook into. And since we're currently trying to finish our increase stitch, it means that is the same hole we want to put our hook into. And you can verify that you saw the right hole because you still have this stitch marker here telling you which hole it should be. So now let's do that second single crochet stitch by yarning over and pulling it through just the horizontal V. So you have 2 loops on the hook. Now yarn over again and pull it through both loops on the hook. So now you have done your second increase stitch, which is why you can see 4 horizontal V's starting from the differently colored stitch marker, which again marks the very first stitch of round 2. Now you can get rid of this other stitch marker that you just used to look at the stitch. Put it aside, you're not going to need it for the rest of the project. Now let's work on the third increase stitch. So this time try not to look at the stitch marker to figure out where you need to put your hook. It's going to be good practice since after this one, you're not going to have the help of a stitch marker to see it. So hopefully you picked this stitch. If you couldn't see it easily, just do that tugging method again to see which hole moves. In this case, this hole moved. And because we're starting a new increase stitch, it means we want to find the next unworked V, which means we need to move 1 over. So put your hook here under that horizontal V, yarn over, bring the yarn through that horizontal V so you have 2 loops on the hook, yarn over again, and bring it through both loops on the hook. Now you need to put your hook in exactly the same spot where you just put it. And if you can't easily see that, just do this tugging method to see which hole moves. And then you can just double confirm that it is indeed this hole because you still have a stitch marker there. Put your hook in it, yarn over, pull it through. So now you have 2 loops left on your hook. Yarn over and pull it through both loops on the hook. And remember to take out the stitch marker when you're done. You don't need it anymore. And now you got to repeat that for the last 3 unworked stitches in your round. So let's also, before I fast forward through that and let you do that on your own, let's just double check that you have the right number of stitches at this point. Remember, we're going for a total of 12 total stitches. So let's rotate our piece so that we can look at the stitch that's marked by the stitch marker, because we know that that is stitch number 1 in round 2. Now let's just make our way around the circle to count. So that was stitch number 1. So here's stitch number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Great. We made 3 increase stitches, which means there's a total of 6 stitches. So this is looking really promising. Next, to confirm that I didn't accidentally skip a stitch or anything along the way, let's count how many unworked stitches there are. And I can tell which ones are the unworked stitches because they're at a different height than these other stitches. It's going around, it's sort of like a seashell. It's going around and then all of a sudden it dips down. So if I do that, I'm still looking for those horizontal V's. I see there's 1 horizontal V, 2, 3, and that's it. Now I'm back to the stitch marker. So great, I'm on track. I just need to make 3 more increase stitches, 1 in each of these unworked V's. So I'm going to fast forward through this and meet you at the end. Okay, I have reached the end of round 2. I know this because I have no more V's that I could possibly crochet into before hitting this stitch marker, which always represents the very first stitch of every round. And I also know this because I've been keeping count of every time I did an increase stitch. But because you're new to crocheting, I would highly recommend counting at the end of each round, if you aren't already counting while you're doing it, how many stitches you have, to just make sure you didn't accidentally skip anything or put too many stitches in. So remember, pull your hook away from your piece so that the working loop becomes really big. And then to count, you're looking for the stitches along the rim, starting with the stitch marked by the stitch marker. So here's stitch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Great. 12 stitches for 6 increased stitches, and you can watch the next video or read below for why 6 increased stitches counts as 12.